cranial nerves. And so essentially what cranial nerves are nerves that originate directly from either the brain or the brain stem. And when it comes to these cranial nerves, there's actually 12 different cranial nerves that we have. And each one of these cranial nerves is going to be paired and present on both sides of the body. Now we use Roman numerals to number these, and we basically number them based on where they emerge from the brain and the brainstem when looking at it front to back. So in order to view these cranial nerves, we want to be viewing the inferior surface of the brain, which is what we have going on here. And essentially what these cranial nerves are doing is that they are relaying information to and from various parts of the body, which are primarily going to be in the head and the neck, and then having that communication with the brain. Now, in order for this relay of information to take place, we have two different types of neurons that we're going to see with these cranial nerves, and these are neurons that we call afferent and efferent. Now, the afferent neurons are sensory neurons that are carrying signals from various sensory stimuli back towards the brain. Now, our efferent neurons are motor neurons that are going to be carrying signals away from the brain to either have some effect on muscle or some other target cells. And you'll see here in a minute when we go through and talk about these different cranial nerves, but some of these cranial nerves are going to be afferent, some of them are going to be efferent, and some of them are actually going to be a combination of both. All right, and so with that said, let's actually move on and talk about the different cranial nerves. Now, what I've done here is I've gone through and colored each of the 12 cranial nerves so that they'll be easier to identify as I'm talking about them here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, and as we talk about each of these cranial nerves, I'm actually going to use the same color that I have identified on the cranial nerves themselves to help to identify where it is that we're actually talking about. All right, so the first nerve that we're going to begin with is, as you can figure, cranial nerve 1, and this is going to be our olfactory nerve. And this cranial nerve is essentially this one that you see right here in green. Now, this cranial nerve is also the first of only two nerves that actually originate from our cerebrum. And this one is essentially a sensory neuron that is responsible for something that we call olfaction, or what we commonly know as sense of smell. All right, the next cranial nerve that we're going to talk about is this one here in blue. And this is going to be cranial nerve 2, which is our optic nerve. And it's this nerve that is the other one of the two nerves that are the only ones originating from our cerebrum. And just like the olfactory nerve, the cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, is solely a sensory nerve and is going to be the one that is responsible for vision. All right, so the next three cranial nerves that I'm going to talk about really can be thought of as a group because they all essentially have a similar effect. And these three cranial nerves that I'm going to talk about are cranial nerve 3 right here, cranial nerve 4 right here, and I'm actually going to skip to cranial nerve 6 right here. All right, so the first one that I pointed out here in the lighter orange, this one is cranial nerve 3, and this is our ocular motor. And this particular nerve originates in the midbrain. And this one is actually strictly a motor neuron. And this nerve here actually has a few different functions. One is it plays a primary role in eye movement, but it also plays a role in some autonomic functions such as our eyelid elevation, our pupillary constriction, as well as the reshaping of the eye and the lens itself, something we call lens accommodation. Now, after cranial nerve 3 comes cranial nerve 4, something that we call our trochlear. This one also originates in the midbrain, and this one is also a motor neuron and plays a key role in our eye movement. And then we actually skipped past cranial nerve 5 in order to talk about cranial nerve 6, which is the one in dark orange, and this is one that we call the abducens. This one actually originates in our pontomedullary region, but just like the last two, this one is also strictly a motor neuron, and if you haven't figured it out, this one actually once again plays a very important role in eye movement. Now, for these 3 cranial nerves, I really didn't go into depth in talking about the different types of eye movements that they're responsible for. In fact, I am going to save that for a future lesson where I'm going to go more in depth into each one of these cranial nerves. But just as a little bit of a hint here, for cranial nerve 6, this is the one that we call abducens. This is because this one actually is in charge of the abduction, which is moving lateral into the outside of our eye. So that's kind of where this name comes from. Alright, so let's talk about cranial nerve number 5, which is the one that I skipped past and is right here. And cranial nerve 5 is one that we call the trigeminal. Now, the trigeminal actually originates from the pons, and this is going to be the first of the cranial nerves that has both the sensory and the motor neuron. So it's both afferent and efferent. Now, for the sensory portion of this nerve, it actually primarily is dealing with 2 things. The first is our facial sensation, and this nerve is actually divided up into 3 parts. This is where the name trigeminal comes from. But it also deals with sensation for our tongue, and this is going to be the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Now, when it comes to the motor portion of this neuron, this is where we're going to be dealing with something called mastication, which is essentially the muscles involved in biting and chewing.
The more you listen to the right words, the more you repeat them at the right time.
Alright, so let's move on and talk about our next nerve, which is going to be this one right here. This one is going to be cranial nerve 7, which is our facial. This one originates from the pontomedullary region as well. And this nerve also serves 2 functions and serves as both a sensory and a motor neuron. For the afferent sensory part of this nerve, this is where we're actually dealing with taste on our tongue. So this is going to be taste on the anterior 2/3 of our tongue. But this is not to be confused with sensation that we just talked about with the trigeminal sensory nerve. Now, when it comes to the motor function of this nerve, there's a couple different things that we deal with. One is it has a primary responsibility in our facial expression, also our eyelid closing, and it also plays a role in our salivation and lacrimation, so basically our ability to make saliva and tear secretion. Alright, moving on is going to be our next neuron, which is going to be this one right here. And this one is actually going to be cranial nerve 8, something that we call the vestibulocochlear. This one once again originates from that pontomedullary region. Now, this nerve here is going to be primarily an afferent sensory neuron, and this one plays an important role in our balance and our hearing. And so this is where we get the name from. The balance is the connection to the vestibule, and the hearing is the connection to the cochlea. And so hence this is where the name vestibulocochlear comes from. Now you may also though hear this one referred to as the auditory nerve. So it is important to know that you may hear this one as well. Alright, so the next nerve that we're going to talk about is going to be this one right here. And this one is going to be cranial nerve number 9, which is our glossopharyngeal. Now, this nerve actually originates from our medulla oblongata. Now, for this one, you might be able to figure out the areas that it is impacting. So it's got in the name here glosso, which we know means tongue, and it also has pharynx, which is coming from pharynx, which we know would be our throat. So this particular nerve is actually both, once again, a sensory and a motor neuron. Now for the sensory portion here, again, we're dealing with taste, but now we're talking about the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. We're also dealing with the sensation of that portion of the tongue, the sensation of the pharynx, and then we also get input from our sinus and our carotid chemo and baroreceptors. And this is partially shared with cranial nerve 10 that we'll talk about in a minute. Now the motor function of this nerve is in muscles dealing with swallowing, and it also aids in our salivation. All right, so moving on to our next cranial nerve. This is going to be this one right here. And this is going to be cranial nerve 10, which is what we refer to as the vagus nerve. This one also originates from our medulla oblongata. So the vagus nerve is actually longer than any of the other nerves that we have. It's absolutely massive. The name really comes from the term vagrant, which comes from the wandering of this nerve. It really kind of wanders all over the place, as you'll see here. Now, the vagus nerve consists of both our sensory and motor neurons. And so when it comes to the sensory portion, here we're dealing with sensations coming from the skin around the ear. It also deals with sensations coming from the pharynx, larynx, thorax, and abdomen. And this is going to be coming from the body's visceral tissues. And then it's also involved in the taste and sensation of the epiglottis. Now, for its motor functions, it plays a role in swallowing, speech, and coughing. Now, it also has an efferent effect as a part of our autonomic function, in particular the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is the one that we can think of as that rest and digest. So here it's going to have an effect of decreased heart rate, increased GI motility, and sweating. All right, the next nerve that I'm going to talk about is this one right here. And this is going to be cranial nerve 11, something that we call the accessory nerve. Now, this one also originates from the medulla oblongata, as well as the cervical spinal cord. And so as a result, sometimes you'll actually also hear this one referred to as the spinal accessory nerve. Now, this nerve is strictly a motor neuron, and this one plays a role in shrugging our shoulders and our head turning. All right, and the last cranial nerve that we're going to talk about is going to be this one located right here. This is cranial nerve 12 and something that we call the hypoglossal. Once again, this nerve originates in the medulla oblongata. Now, this one you may also be able to figure out what its purpose is based on its name. Once again, we see that glossal, which we know was dealing with the tongue. Hypo, we know means under, so we're dealing with here a motor function dealing with the muscles under the tongue, which are responsible for tongue movement. All right, so we covered a lot with these cranial nerves. Let's go over a couple different strategies and ways to help you kind of remember what these nerves are and what their function is.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct.
All right, the first of these ways to kind of help you guys to remember these different cranial nerves is a silly little picture that we can draw. And the way it works is we start out by drawing the number 1. Now we're going to be drawing a face here, so the 1 is going to represent the nose, which we know is our olfactory. Then we're going to go ahead and draw 2 eyes, because we know cranial nerve number 2 is our optic nerve. Then we're going to do 2 3s like this, some 4s, and some 6s. And these are to help us remember that cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor, cranial nerve 4, the trochlear, and cranial nerve 6, the abducens, are all having to deal with eye movement. Then we have cranial nerve 5, which is the trigeminal, which we know has to deal with our facial sensations. Now, since we're talking about the face, let's not forget about cranial nerve number 7, our facial nerve. Cranial nerve 8, which is our vestibular cochlear, we know would make great ears right here. And number 9, the glossopharyngeal, has an important role in our tongue and our pharynx, and so that makes an excellent addition right here. We can add the vagus nerve as it plays an important role in that swallowing and speech. And while we're here, let's not forget about number 12, which deals with the movement of the tongue. And then finally, we're just left with cranial nerve 11, which we know is dealing with the shoulder shrugging and the head turning. So as you can see, a silly little face that we draw here that really kind of helps us to remember which cranial nerves are dealing with what part. Now, in addition to this, we also have a couple mnemonics that can help us remember these names. Now, there's 2 different ones that I'm going to show you. One is a little bit older, more classic version, and one is a little bit more up-to-date one. So for the first mnemonic, which is our classic one, it goes something like this. On old Olympus's towering top, a Finn and German viewed some hops. Now here, I'm not sure why a Finn and a German want to view some hops, but this saying really goes back a while and helps us to remember the name of each of the cranial nerves, starting from 1 and going all the way down to 12. The key things to know here is when we're dealing with this particular mnemonic, this A here and this S here are dealing with some of the alternative names for these cranial nerves that I had talked about. Now, each of the beginning letters in the mnemonic help us to remember the beginning letter of the name of the particular cranial nerve. So here we have, starting from the top going to the bottom, we have the olfactory, we have the optic, we have the ocular motor, we have the trochlear, the trigeminal, the abducens, facial. The next one is going to be the auditory, which we also know as the vestibulocochlear. Then we have the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, the spinal accessory, and the hypoglossal. So on old Olympus towering top, a Finn and German viewed some hops. As long as you can remember that we're dealing with the auditory and spinal accessory, it can help you to remember the order of those cranial nerves. Now, another more modern version that I actually prefer is this one here. Let's put it over here. And this one goes, on occasion, our trusty truck acts funny. Very good vehicle anyhow. Now here, once again, the first letter lines up with the first letter of that particular cranial nerve's name. Now here for this one, for this cranial nerve and this cranial nerve here, you can see we have different letters because we're going with the actual name that we had talked about. So once again, we have our olfactory, our optic, our ocular motor, our trochlear, our trigeminal, the abducens, facial, vestibular cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal nerves. So hopefully one of these two mnemonics, or perhaps that picture that I drew, will help you to remember these. The last little thing I want to do real quick here is to share another little mnemonic that we have in order to help us remember whether these are sensory or motor neurons, or in fact if they're both. So let me go ahead and put the letters up here, and here we're dealing with S being sensory, M being motor, and B being both. Now the first one, and this is actually my personal favorite, goes, some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. The other mnemonic that I've heard that some people also prefer is